Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends from all over the world. My name is Tetet Lauron, and I'm an advisor for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. And before we start our talk show this evening, because it's 10 p.m. in my time zone, may we request you to please kindly rename yourselves and if you could add your where you're coming from, where you're joining us from, as well as your organization, so that we could see um, the breadth and how diverse our participants are in this evening's talk show. And by now, you are probably all super pros at using Zoom. So please utilize the chat box for any and all comments or questions that you may have. Just to let you know also that we will be recording this session as well as streaming live on Facebook at the Rosa Luxemburg NYC Facebook page. And we also have a nice surprise for everyone. We are going to be doing a visual recording of this session by our friends from the Tofu Creatives, and we'll be showing you towards the end of the webinar of the talk show what they've come up with. We also like to let you know that we have Spanish interpretation provided for this session. So you will see there's tiny globe at the bottom of your screen. If you would need interpretation into Spanish, then please click on the Spanish interpretation button. All right? So I think folks are starting to come in, and that is really, really good. And we look forward to a very engaging talk show with our red and expert panel of friends. But before that, I'd like to hand you over to Mr. Andreas Gunther, who is the Executive Director of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung New York office. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tetet. I'd like to welcome you all very warmly for this talk show. I think it's the first talk show that RS NYC ever does. I'm really excited about this new format, and I thank Tetet for proposing this, bringing forward this idea. Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is an international network, is an NGO with an international network of offices in about 24 offices in about operating around more than 80 countries. We are dedicated to civic education, to fostering progressive thinking around the globe, and we are working with a broad network of partner organizations. The office in New York is the Office for North America and the United Nations. As the Office for the United Nations, we have observer status with ECOSOC. And of course, we are interested in fostering the debates around the processes that are connected to the United Nations, that have influence to our lives, to the processes in the world. And in this sense, of course, we are looking very closely on financing for development, and we want to bring this debate forward. RS has taken interest in the discourse around the Green New Deal. We see it as a vision whose key elements resonate with the Foundation's analysis of the structural and historical roots of the climate crisis and the need for profound transformations in the way economic, political and social systems are structured in international, regional and national levels. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung recognizes the crucial role that a new internationalism plays in this and highlights the need for transformation, particularly in the norm-setting, accountability functions of the multilateral system. This is an introductory webinar, or that's why we made it a bit more informal, and it's aimed to a general audience. And we wanted to organize education spaces also later around the climate, around HLPF and the COP, the Conference of Parties uh, of the climate UN Climate Treaty. So I'm really excited to hear the talk today, and looking forward to the question that will be discussed. So I give the floor back to Tetet.
Thank you very much, Andreas. And as many of you already know, the FFD Forum concluded a couple of days ago. The FFD Forum aiming to advance the dialogues on financing pandemic recovery and the SDGs. Now, we saw that governments and many multilateral institutions debated and later on adopted by consensus the outcome document of the FFD. Now, what's interesting is that, many member states, many governments were quite unhappy over issues fundamental to having a shot, not just at surviving, but also recovering justly and fairer. Now, this may all sound a little bit too technical for comfort, but really, it's important for us to unpack what this really means because it is truly political. And as I've said with some colleagues, no, the FFD outcomes is way too important to be left to the official negotiators alone. So let's try and see what this really mean, especially for people on the ground. Okay, so for today's session, we've invited our red and expert panel, and I'll be introducing them to you. I'm sure you already know them, but briefly, we have Bhumika Muchhala, who is an activist, advocate, educator, and researcher on the international financial architecture and the structural, racial, and gendered inequalities between and within nations. Bhumika has had more than 2 decades resisting neoliberal paradigms. So she's originally from India, grew up in Indonesia, and is currently based in New York. All right? So we welcome Bhumika to our panel tonight. Next is Emilia Reyes, who is a director at Equidad de Género, a feminist Mexican organization. Now, Emilia is highly visible and very tireless in engaging in intergovernmental negotiations, whether it's climate, SDGs, FFD, and Emilia is also co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. And last but not the least, of course, my good friend Vitalis Meja, who is executive director of the Reality of Aid Africa. He is based in Nairobi, Kenya. And Meja has over 20 years in development work. He's an expert on aid and development effectiveness issue, as well as the debt campaign in Africa. So, Andreas mentioned it's a talk show. No, how's it different from a webinar? Well, basically because we are having an animated discussion, conversation between us, and we will not be using the formula death by PowerPoints. Yeah. So I think that's one innovative feature. No PowerPoints allowed in this talk show. All right. So let's dive deep already. And yeah, I call on Emilia and Bumika to share their thoughts on this first question that I'm going to throw on them. Okay? So the FFD topic sounds either abstract or too high up in the clouds for normal people to comprehend. No, it's quite intimidating. So, given your long experience in these policy spaces and also with social movements and civil society, can you explain to us what FFD means to you and why it is at the core of many global injustices that we resist and seek to change? So, Emilia, over
Yes,
to you.
thank you so much for this invitation. I love the fact that this is a talk show. I've always been wanted to be in a talk show, so now this is my dream come true. So thank you so much, and I'm super happy to be joining this powerful panel. So, just before starting, I wanted to say that we can take some steps back and say that the thing with the current situation in the world now is that the multilateral sphere as a whole is in crisis. So it's not only that we are in a crisis within the sanitary framing or economic or environmental, it's also that there is a political crisis. And so all of the traditional points of entry to which the world resorted to solve problems which were under the rooftop of the UN now are really weakened. And so we see that on the one hand, a lot of, this huge trend of nationalistic responses happening all around the world. And on the other hand, we see that there is a rise in fascism, in dictatorial regimes that are really very negatively impacting the global response to what is happening right now. So in that framing is that this has been also a very fruitful setting for richer and developed countries to really take advantage of this position and to enhance the powerful actors like the financial sector, the digital industry, the extractive industries, etc., to keep on acting on their best interest without really bearing in mind what is happening to the international community as a whole. So then coming back to the FFD, it is really the space in which the international community could come to solve the solutions, to solve the problems that are happening, but in a comprehensive manner. So we're not talking about isolated spaces in which, okay, we are here talking about the debt crisis, in another we're only talking about the issue of illicit financial flows, which are flows from coming out from the global south to the global north in an illicit manner by means of abuse, or even talking about the solution for gender equality or migrant people, etc. So it is a space addressing all of the systemic issues, and this is why it's so crucial at this point to try to turn back to the FFD Forum and the FFD platform as a whole, to give it back the right place it should be having to find the common solutions for the world. So I'm gonna give now the floor to Bhumika.
All right, Bhumika, what's your take on the FFD? Why is it at the core of many of the global injustices?
Well, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful talk show, and I'm so honored to be here. So yes, this is exciting. I just maybe start with that FFD is about 7 core areas. It's about debt, domestic revenue mobilization, private finance, official development assistance, trade, technology, and last but certainly not least, systemic financial issues. And if we look at the history of how FFD came into being, it was an initiative that was led by developing countries in the United Nations General Assembly. It was triggered largely by a strong discontent about the systemic shortcomings of the international financial architecture, laid bare by recurrent crises throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. So the first conference, the Monterey Conference of 2002 that produced the Monterey Consensus, and this was a manifestation of that long discontent of developing countries that wanted to put forward in the United Nations, important because the United Nations is to date the only international venue for universal participation, one country, one vote, where all countries can participate, and especially where the global south developing countries have a voice. They certainly don't in the IMF and World Bank, as we know. Voice matches financial quota power in the Bretton Woods institutions. So the countries that contribute more finances and that have larger economies have larger voice. And thus, the United Nations is really the only space for universal participation. When we talk about systemic inequalities, we're talking about a direct through line from colonialism to today's international economic order. We're talking about the structural arrangements in global finance that create, maintain, and in fact continually reproduce structural racial and gendered inequalities between and within nations. So we're talking about structural drivers that essentially create and maintain poverty, underdevelopment, inequality, and injustice, right? So it is a very it was an incredibly salient turn from the from the colonial modes of development, such as aid or such as and over emphasis on foreign direct investment and commodity dependency and multinational corporations. It was a forum that was supposed to be talking about the systemic issues around sovereign debt, around capital flows, around financial regulation, around the management of interest rates, and especially around the ability of developing countries to employ policy space in their fiscal, monetary, and capital management policies, right? So while it may sound technical, we're really essentially talking about a couple of key things. We're talking about sovereignty, we're talking about autonomy, and we're talking about capability, the policy space, the ability to actually enact development oriented um, policies and frameworks that meet the economic and social rights of people. So ultimately, FFD is about the larger global struggles of social movements and all warrior defenders across different arenas. These are not just technical policy, they are essentially the means and ways, the tools, discourses, and strategies, by which hierarchies of racial, gender, class, caste, and sexuality play out. And it's a cycle. And these socially constructed hierarchies shape the policy paradigms, and the policy paradigms in turn reinforce and maintain the strength of these hierarchies. If we look at the political economy of the world today, we see a gendered and racialized political economy, right? We see a racialized and gendered division of labor, including in the global value chains that is such a sort of discourse in development economics. So we are talking about power and oppression and control. And the struggle of FFD, we're talking about equity, liberation, and autonomy, using some of these historical principles that have been created in the UN space by developing countries, such as policy space, such as common but differentiated responsibilities, such as North-South cooperation, and a particular principle that the South may cooperate with each other. They may have all kinds of financial flows and cooperation with each other. But the South-South cooperation does not substitute for North-South commitments and obligations. And the North-South commitment obligations take account of the extremely differentiated political economy and power and resource that is historically produced, right? So to me, FFD is the current manifestation of the new international economic order, except that it certainly doesn't have the political ambition of the NIEO. But if we have any kind of attempt at trying to enact the visions and the priorities of the South, it would be the financing for development. Thank you.
Wow. And that is just the first question, my dear friends. No, we get carried away because it really appears that what both Emilia and Bhumika have just told us, it's not the FFD forum that I just attended last week. It seems like a universe away. You're talking about a parallel universe here where, you know, uh, equity, justice, sovereignty, that's too far off from what I've observed last week. So we'll get back to you on that, no? And a reminder before we get too carried away, there's interpretation going on. So if we could speak a little bit slower so that our Spanish-speaking friends can also catch up in our conversation. All right. So, on to my question number two. There's a lot of high level meetings that continue to take place, despite the absence of mass face to face meetings. We hear the UN Secretary General and other world leaders call for greater solidarity, international cooperation as the only ways out of the worst impacts of this pandemic. What's your take on this? Based on the outcomes of the FFD Forum, are these things the world can pin its hopes on for a just recovery? So I'll ask Meja first, no? And then Emilia, I'll give you a few seconds to collect your thoughts, but let's hear first from Meja. All right, my friend.
I thank you very much. And also let me begin by thanking you and your colleagues for organizing this very important debate. I think it is very timely, and I'm glad it is a talk show. We don't have to use PowerPoints. So it gives me more freedom to speak freely. Now, indeed, I think it's something that we really have to reflect on, especially with regard to the decision-making process that is currently being deployed, where most decisions are taken virtually, and in those decision-making forums, there's a lot of exclusion, where, I remember in one of those sessions when the civil society were getting too hot, you'll see session closed. So increasingly, we are seeing tendencies of, decisions being taken elsewhere and then being lumped on the rest of the international community. So that's one. So I think indeed the pandemic is really reduced or shrunk the policy space for dialogue in that context. And in that regard, you've seen those who have resources and means and structures to influence have really hijacked the whole of the FFD process. So when it comes to the agenda, for example, you find there's a lot of emphasis on how do you mobilize private sector and how do you incentivize private sector to be involved. And we all know that private sector doesn't need to be incentivized. As long as there's a profit to be made, you don't need to do anything. They'll just come. So the question of, the priority within the FFD for me is because while in the normative sense, it is a good thing, it's a good forum, it provides a democratic space for all member countries to engage. I think increasingly is becoming very exclusive and very much driven by those who are driving private sector agenda. So there is really limited space, for developing countries to exert any influence, and much more so in terms of directing the agenda in the forum and ensuring that, we are really touching the pubs. And I think in that context, you can also look at the overall agenda that we had last week. I mean, Bhumika just outlined the main thematic areas of the FFD. How many of those were about private sector? You'd find half the agenda was about private sector and mostly how to address debt issues. Not that they are not important, but we have very important thematic areas that have serious impact on development that we are not giving equal attention to. And I think really, if we are not careful with the direction that we are taking, we might lose it. And this is where the civil society voices come in terms of making sure that we stick to the agenda of FFD, which was about defining norms and creating relevant, instruments that indeed are able, one, to mobilize resources, both qualitatively and quantitatively, but two, to make sure that we have remedial measures that address the crisis. And I think right now it's not really about solidarity alone. It's also about accountability, because we have developed sufficient norms in the global systems to get us through a pandemic. So it's really about countries stepping up and saying, well, we committed to this. For example, we committed to 0.7. Let us fulfill those requirements and see how we go. We don't need to go back to the table and start negotiating again. I thank you, Madam Chair.
This is not a negotiations, Major. I am not Madam Chair. I am Tetet, your friend and comrade. Anyhow, you've mentioned a lot of important things, no? I got private sector, accountability, inclusion, priority. So these things probably not in the same breath, but already gives us some idea on how things are. What's the state of play in terms of these high level negotiations? So, Emilia, you're a fixture in all of these UN meetings. What say you?
Um, I'm really now threading into dangerous waters because I want to say that so far in attending the SDGs negotiations, the climate change negotiations, all of these have proven to be quite fruitless in the sense that regardless of the high ideas they convey, whenever they come to the operative language and the mandates, we all get extremely disappointed because they refuse to dwell on precisely the systemic barriers. What are the real problems? And I feel like we're dealing with several beasts here, right? For on the one hand, we have the debt crisis, the sanitary crisis, meaning that governments also, in FFD terms as well, that governments do not have the proper fiscal space, meaning that the funding that they could get from their revenues are going into different places. They need to pay debt service. They are not in a good position to garner stronger revenues because of the race to the bottom, meaning that the private sector is threatening governments to lower their taxation rates in order for them to come and invest, and it is a real trap. But also in the climate change arena, we see, for instance, that governments from the developed countries are committed to 100 billion per year for to help support developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation measures, whereas we see that figure on 100 billion as opposed to the trillions that we see flowing from the global south to the global north, either on illicit financial flows or on the paying and debt service, etc. So we see that there is like a disconnect between, on the one hand, all of these, as you going back to your question, in addressing in this myriad of forums different topics, and there is this disconnect between those siloed approaches and the need for an encompassing and comprehensive view of the matter. It's not that debt is an isolated issue and climate change is on another. I would recommend very much the paper by Yolanda Fresnillo on the linkages between these two issues, improving how, without addressing the debt crisis, we cannot address the environmental crisis. And all of these issues that we're talking about, that about power, about being imposed on the weaker countries, on the poorer countries, on an unfair platform, is precisely because I would say these richer countries are promoting the proliferation of this myriad of platforms precisely to avoid discussing them in a comprehensive manner and in really addressing the systemic issues in a platform like the FFD, which would really would take a real assessment on what is their role in promoting these inequalities and what is their role in actually benefiting from the pandemic, the economic crisis, the recession, and how they are allowing entities like the financial sector to keep on profiting. And I will say that it is also an infamous role, the one that the IMF and the IFIs as a whole are playing in all of these situations, because rather than really promoting, on the one hand, a political setting in which real solution can be found in bringing all of the actors to the discussion, they really even keep on investing on fossil fuels projects. They keep on, how do you say, catering to the private investors and catering to the large mega projects, etc. So, and even I will say, promoting these austerity measures, there is always a new name coming to bring in behind austerity measures. But we know so far from decades ago, that austerity measures coming in conditionalities in reducing the fiscal space and for social investment is really impacting on women, on people who are actually in the most informal settings, and and they're depleting the access to citizens to exercise their human rights. So it's really now at this point kind of it's not only perverse, it's, you really wonder why are they really wanting to worsen the situation of people on the ground. And from my end, also as a feminist, I want to highlight that we've seen the regression of women's human rights 20 years. And we see that in all of these fora on economic and financial dynamics, that they're just leaving this issue of gender as a national priority. And that is another perverse situation, not only gender, but climate change or revenues, etc., without recognizing that the global these issues need to be solved at the global level. They cannot be solved at national or regional level. And there is this perversity on coming back, like in the SDGs, of reporting at the national level. Now in the FFD, we're seeing as well the reporting at the national level, and that is perverse in the sense that they keep on coming into this falsehood, like the local situation is going to solve all the problem, without really going as well into the zooming out and addressing the macro. So it is perverse. I would just let me sum up what I was saying. The multiple fora are a divestment of attention from the comprehensive analysis and solutions that we need in a conference, in a summit that really addresses all of these issues. And we lost the opportunity in the FFD Forum. There was a proposal in the initial draft, and the developed countries refused. Actually, we saw that there was a lot of momentum from developing countries, even from the office of the FFD in the UN, and we saw that there was a pushback for that, and now the decision has been delayed for next year. But now it is time that the civil society and social movements keep on calling for that in the lead towards the General Assembly, because we cannot leave all of those isolated fora and even those manly club like the G20, the G7, the OECD, the Paris Club. We really need to go back and align forces and head towards the General Assembly, asking for a summit in which under the floor of the FFD agenda, such as Bhumika presented, in which we can really address all of these issues that we've been talking. Thank you.
All right. So Emilia and Major touched upon a lot of issues already that it's truly concerning, no? Actually, when I was listening to the deliberations after the outcome document has been accepted or adopted, it's like, what? Member states are questioning the mandate to talk about climate change in the FFD. They're questioning the mandate to talk about this issue and that issue. So it's like, I was thinking, there is only one United Nations. So how come, these governments are trying to throw the ball to this mechanism, to that UN body, to this forum? It's like you talk about coherence, you talk about breaking down the silos, but here you are, when confronted precisely with those macro issues, they tend to pass the ball around so that they can escape and evade responsibility for addressing those things head on. So it's also very interesting uh, that FFD was originally envisioned to address the systemic inequities of the global economic order. But somehow it's been whittled down, to a talk shop, another talk show for pledges. And these are not even binding commitments that we're talking about. These are pledges to finance the SDGs and climate action. So you mentioned you're quite frustrated and disappointed. So, you know, are there international institutions that we could think about, that may be equipped to talk about decolonization, to talk about, transforming architectures, infrastructures, etc.? Um, let's hear from Bhumika. What do you think about this? And then after Bhumika, I'll go back to Emilia and then to Meja. Over to you.
Hi. So, when we're talking about, what's happening geopolitically in the UN right now and with the financing for development, let's just zoom back and think that, this is the crisis of a generation. This is a massive global economic recession, with the World Bank projecting 170 million people will fall into poverty due to the coronavirus economic shock, due to the economic recession, the plunge in tax revenues, the unemployment, and the gendered pandemic, the unpaid care economy. So we're talking about this really massive, colossal economic crisis, and the UN, as the premier international organization, is not stepping forward. The fact that calling for a fourth International Financing for Development Conference was not activated by the forum last week is a crying shame. I mean, that is the point of these forums, is to activate a larger intergovernmental conference. Why is the conference important? Because these conferences get the wheels turning on policy norms, on the normative framework. For example, the FFD panel report on the illicit financial flows and tax cooperation put forward concrete recommendations. And this was a product arising out of the third international conference in Addis Ababa, where there was a paragraph that talked about putting forward the FFD panel and the concrete results on illicit financial flows. So what we really needed right now, the key thing we needed right now, was a concrete systemic solution to the debt pandemic today, right? We are facing a debt pandemic where a reported 194 billion had been transferred from developing countries to private, multilateral, and bilateral creditors just in 2020. And 58 countries experienced more revenue leaving their borders than coming in. In a time of health crisis, right? At least 62 countries are spending more on paying back debt than they are on their domestic healthcare urgent response. 36 countries are spending more to paying back debt than to education expenditure. The G20 has completely inserted itself at the center of the debt architecture, not doing anything more than mere tokenistic suspensions 6 months at a time, cans kicking down the road, absolutely no attempt at building a debt workout mechanism. The Civil Society Financing for Development Coalition, a large group of NGOs and activists from around the world, have been coordinating and systematically calling for a sovereign debt workout mechanism under the auspices of the UN that would comprehensively address unsustainable and illegitimate debt, because we need a fair, impartial, and transparent process to address the debt pandemic. So such a conference could have been activated to call forward a fourth conference, to call forward a systemic debt solution, and to call forward a real attempt at addressing, right, systemic issues. Now, it's not surprising that just as on our side for economic justice and for policy space for the right to development, we are looking at this crisis as this is a key opportunity to actually break through and to make, paradigmatic change, to do, consciousness shifting and rehaul these entrenched, ossified systems and policies. At the same time, the G20 and the Bretton Woods institutions have also been looking at it as a prime opportunity. The IMF's lending power has skyrocketed in its emergency financing as well as in its loan programs. The World Bank has aggressified its private first agenda called the Maximizing Financing for Development, a clever and tricky ploy of using the same sort of acronym, where the World Bank's agenda has been very clear usher. It's to cater to investor and creditor interests, particularly through public-private partnerships and infrastructures, as well as public services, by using so-called blended financing instruments. It sounds, benign, blended financing instruments, but it uses public resources, government resources, to subsidize private investments or to provide guarantees for them. We are seeing a larger, institutional consensus to cater to the gods of private finance, to do everything to lower their risks, to facilitate their entry, to cater to them, whether it's through global tax competition, labor rights flexibilization, also entrenched by the World Bank's doing business indicators that there is now a fantastic and strong civil society campaign on. There are basically an architecture to really entrench private finance. Unfortunately, the UN Secretary General has taken on this agenda. It was done during the Sustainable Development Goals. As soon as it was adopted, it essentially became a vehicle to facilitate public-private partnerships. With the rationales from billions to trillions, governments don't possibly have this kind of money. We need private financing. We need the scale of financing. All the things that this narrative obscures and omits and marginalizes is exactly the right to development and the historical inequalities that prevent it, the policy paradigms today that obstruct it. We're talking about fiscal drains, whether from debt, corporate tax evasion, capital outflows, tariff liberalization. We're talking about the blockades to development, such as the performance requirements in bilateral investment treaties, global value chains that lock developing countries into exploited, gendered, and low value added labor without being able to go up the industrial policy ladder in manufacturing value added. We're talking about intellectual property rights at the center of everything today with vaccine nationalism and apartheid, because the TRIPS waiver is the greatest single factor in pandemic recovery. And the fact that India...
All right.
so all of these things, I think, really go to a political economy where we need to mobilize a campaign around private finance and around the overall agenda of occluding structural issues in favor of private money. Thanks.
Okay, Bhumika is on fire, and rightly so, because last week's FFD Forum was just horrible, no? And to think that the UN Secretary General started it off by calling out governments that we're not doing enough, we have failed, and now this, no? So, Emilia, bring on the fire. We need more of that.
I'm gonna say very horrible things. First of all, is that I think that the SG it's coming to his term is coming to an end, and we've heard him being more radical in his calls in the past year. And yet, I'm gonna say this as a personal impression, not my organizational hat, is that he really weakened the UN. It's really sad because we haven't seen any real progress on any of the agendas. During the pandemic, rather than strengthening the political will for an international cooperation, it rather lowered the political ranking of the UN, meaning that now it seems like it is useless for countries to turn to the UN for any solution whatsoever. Even the COVAX initiative is failing down in the momentum on investments and to really promote even better deals in acquiring vaccines. So it is really a shame. You've seen how his calls for the climate emergency are very strong, but really have been not undertaken. So I would say this is something that I think we need to start discussing about. There is a new term for the ESG, but really we need to turn back and evaluate what has been the role of the UN in the past years in its leadership. And I think that is one thing that we shouldn't undermine. The second one, of course, I will bring back to the audience all of those those analyses made by Barbara Adams and other very brave colleagues who have been exposed in the corporate capture of the UN. But second, I also wanted to say that it is very important to say that given that the inequalities disposition at this moment is like, for instance, I wanted just to share with you a figure that the wealthiest billionaires increased their profits last year for $10.2 trillion dollars, and women in their unpaid domestic and care work, they produced $10.8 trillion in the value just last year. So that makes it like how is it that there is this correlation between those that are the most exploited and those that are really profiting from the capitalistic system? So it is not a separate dimension. It is really correlating from one bottom to the other. Where is the extraction coming from? And so when we see all of those calls for solidarity as if this were an issue of the poor people and we need to do charity, or we need to give them local and micro solutions like micro lending, or like entrepreneurship, and or nudging or behaviorist economy projects, is really like a divestment of the real solutions that we need, and it is really detaching the problems on the ground from the origin of the problem. And that's where I also think that I'm gonna be fired away in this forum. I think civil society also has a responsibility, and social movements in not realizing the importance of the macro agenda. They keep on going back to the local level over and over, to the testimonial dimension over and over, as if we didn't know what is poverty looking like. We've been measuring poverty for 120 years, from debt to width. We're measuring it from income, from the indexes of quality of life, etc. We know how that looks like, and it's poverty porn at this point. What many of the social movements and organizations, especially INGOs, are turning to. We know how the local level is suffering. And there is a space for testimonial, but testimonials are not going to find the technical and the political and the systemic points of origin of the challenges. So that insistence on let's bring a poor woman to tell us how is she living in a space like FFD Forum or like UNCTAD, we know that we really need to expose who are going to promote those programs. And those are the wealthier countries, the developed countries. We know that is the financial sector. We know that are the countries that are refusing to agree to the TRIPS waiver. And we don't see the real support on the floor for those big struggles. And so I think that is also a challenge that we need to undertake. And finally, I also want to say, from the point of view of a feminist from the global south, we also need to expose our colleagues from the developed countries. They have been turning and relying on the advocacy and the work of developed countries to promote progressive agendas. We need them to turn to their governments. We need them to turn to their negotiating groups to try to say, not only to ask them, but to demand as citizens that they are expecting as well a change. Because it has been also a perverse dynamic that we've seen in the past years in the climate negotiation, in all of the issues that are related to economic issues. Relying on the seeds, relying on the LDCs, relying on poor countries to say, please give me, I need this, look at my reality. And it's obscene how we really need now to see our developed countries, civil society, to step up their game, to really challenge their governments. In the global south, we are being harassed. We see that our colleagues, for instance, in Indonesia, in Turkey, etc., being prosecuted. So we really need them to start challenging the power at their own places. And I think that is going to be a real game changer. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying we need differentiated measures, but they cannot keep on using the same discourse. And especially now that we saw that the failure of the FFD, we cannot continue with that same discourse towards the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia. And I do share your point of view about poverty porn. I say climate porn, how many dead bodies, the body bags, that sells. But it's really very important that we also take stock of where we can be uh, also progressing our narrative. How do you advance our own civil society critique and narrative in all of these things? And certainly not with those pocket sized solutions. Because as you said, those macro issues, macro problems do not, there's a disconnect between the macro problems and the pocket size solutions that are being promoted. So, Meja, we'd like to hear from you. And I would request that the chat box is really, really super active and it's cool, no? I see a lot of really great comments. And perhaps in the next round, we'll try to open up, for some more questions and reflections from our friends in the audience. So, Meja, what's your take on all of these things around the failure of the multilateral system, and perhaps your thoughts also on a question that Bodo raised in the chat box? What could be the best way for activists to influence the FFD negotiations and contribute to shaping its outcome? I think Bodo's being jaded here or optimistic. I don't know which one.
I would say thank you very much, Emilia. I really enjoyed that talk. I think that was excellent and really covered most of some of the things that we want to say, but we can't say them out loud. So I have to thank you for saying them. I think let me start with the civil society issue that I think also Emilia raised, which I also agree fully with. It's really one of the responsibilities of civil society is to set the agenda, to set the tone and set the bar. And what we need to ask ourselves is that in our engagement with the UN, how well are we doing that? Because increasingly, if we can get into a meeting that was set to address development, with development being the main focus, and we start discussing private sector and we will start contributing into that discussion without serious protests, then there is something that we need to address here. So I think our role in setting the agenda, our role in putting political pressure, as before, has a bit waned down. So to the extent that we try to fit into this, provide country experiences, a community-based experience, and we rush with that when we know there's a bigger picture, especially in the elements that Bhumika raised. So I think one of the things that we need to really think carefully is, how do we want to engage with this process going forward, especially with regard to the political, global political processes in terms of setting the policy agenda, and really saying, no, we have to stick to the original mandate, the original agenda and objectives of the FFD, and go back there. And really, for example, I was listening last time, and I remember I had some exchange with colleagues. We had a session on one of the main pillars of the FFD's official development assistance, and that particular pillar was missing. Instead, it was subjected into some debt discussion and a minor question, a third question. Yet this is a very important instrument, resource envelope that is supposed to help development. And it was one of the elements that actually politically was very activated in terms of setting a target that members used to, that members agreed to. So I think it is really important that going forward, we as civil society must play our activist role. And in playing activist role, we have to, one, set the agenda, but two, work very closely. We need to begin mobilizing from the national level, because also this is where the problem is. You have countries in the south speaking not necessarily from what the interests of the citizens are coming from. And I would say that very confidently because 2 weeks ago, the Kenyan citizens summoned the World Bank and the IMF to disclose who are the beneficiaries of the monies that they are giving. And you know what the bank and the fund told them? That it is not in our interest to give you this information. So in terms of really making use of the citizen, of the population to advance our agenda, we need to go back to that drawing board and make sure that we mobilize effectively. I don't think that we can really make use of these global institutions the way they are currently hijacked to bring about any transformation. We have to go back to the drawing board and really make use of the political power that we also possess as civil society to really bring about, behavior change at the national level, setting the agenda at the national level, and ensure that this also cascade. And I think there also is really the question of also trying to make sure that our advocacy or our activist initiatives also resonate with the population, because that's the only way where we can address the mindset question, especially with the governments who are the main actors here, and largely also because we can put pressure on the bank and the fund if our governments get their act together. But it's only us to get our governments to get our act together. So I think the transformation begins from the ground up. And then at the upper level, then I think like Emilia was saying, is really make sure that in terms of articulating some of the issues that we bring up, we have authentic people from the South really voicing these concerns, that we need to build the capacity to be able to take those spaces and articulate them, not necessarily reflecting on how their scenarios are. That is very important indeed, but really be able to capture that in the global context that we find ourselves, where there is that fight between ourselves and the rest of this. So we civil society need to go back to the drawing board. I thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to Emilia, Meja, and Bhumika for that question. But the night is still young, and so are we. I have one more question for the three of you. And then we're also encouraging our friends to share their feedback and comments, although the chat box has also been filled up with a lot of comments, mostly in support of what you three have already mentioned. So let me go to my next question for all of you. So the world is now at a critical juncture. We all know that. Governments, institutions, they're all singing the same tune, a climate positive recovery that can be done through net zero emissions, nature based solutions, BBB through PPP, or building back better through public private partnerships. Now, stripped off this feel good packaging, we all know that these are all neoliberal prescriptions designed to make capitalism green. Even the World Economic Forum said that they have to reinvent capitalism uh, pre-pandemic going forward. No, and but over the years, economic justice movements have put forth a detailed vision of how we can transform global economic governance. So let me now ask you to put on your activist hats, as what May just said. How do you see this vision intersecting with other justice movements? So, are there ways that the global economic justice movement or global economic justice demands can support the demands for ecological, feminist, perhaps anti-militarist demands? And let me make it more complicated for you. Should we work to strengthen the United Nations or start a new entity altogether? Not my question. That's one from the chat box. So maybe think about it. Um, you can choose not to answer all of the questions, but maybe pick out one question that appeals or speaks to you the most. All right? Emilia, you're smiling already at me. I'm sure you have a lot to say. So go ahead.
Much. You're making me go first. First of all, I want to say that with the last question, despite of all of our disappointment, and I've seen Diana's comment, and of course yours, that about the FFD process and overall in different processes like the SDGs or the climate change or the habitat, etc. The UN is still the only place, as Bhumika was saying, that has the potential of becoming a place of transformation because it is universal, because it sits every actors on the table, because it works under the amazing framing of the human rights framework that's promoting progressivity of rights, and that is including several principles that are key to humanity as a whole right now. So that is one thing. The thing is, I think that it has also been weakened by many through the interrelation of many political factors. I wouldn't say it's just internally or externally. So there are many elements, and I think this is a conversation that we need to have as a whole. But the point about how we can really strengthen our work, I don't know. I mean, the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development has been promoting a campaign of campaigns, and we've struggled. I want to share that in public. We've struggled because of the actors have been super busy in their own campaigns, in their working silos, and the Women's Working Group is trying to fundraise for this global campaign that is really trying to echo and amplify the voices of different campaigns, but even articulated with them has been very difficult. But then given the past experience, now I'm convinced that this is the way forward, because the campaigns of campaigns, we can paste the link here, and I would really invite everybody to join and support. Because I'd say this is the way forward. I mean, on the one hand, we are saying that there is a reluctance on the actors that are in position of power, but on the other, we are seeing as well that there has been a failure on the side of the social movements to really garner around some collective action in this comprehensive manner. And I don't want to put on the burden on social movements. I'm just saying that we've also been very used to our own strategies, and you see how even within the feminist movement, the hesitancy, the reluctance in working with other movements, because there is so many at stake for women's rights in terms of bodily autonomy. And now we've seen that the pushback from conservative actors is really targeting as well women's human rights. But on the side of those working at the territory, they feel also a very strong reluctance in working with technical actors, because they think they are tokenizing them. We see that the labor movement is also in need to keep on having conversation with the corporate sector, etc. So there are many tensions at play. So I'd say we really need to overcome those tensions and come up at least with the minimal denominator in the structural demands. I'm not saying the minimal denominator in those solutions that are worth for nothing, like empowerment or resilience, that are pushing back the responsibility back on women or communities, but really on structural solutions. So that would be my first take on as activists. But also on the second one is it takes a lot of work, and I'm saying also recognizing the political tensions. I don't think we should undermine them. There are tensions based on the nature of these conversations, and we need to acknowledge those. Even the exhaustion and even the lack of access to the virtual modality, I don't think we have discussed as of yet with enough depth. What does it mean to be in the era of virtual negotiations? And we have taken for granted that when they say, well, the system doesn't allow more than 2 people in the system, we've said, okay, I'm sorry, so let's share these 2 slots between ourselves. And sometimes we say, okay, I'm sorry, but we cannot be attending the negotiations. I think we need to have have a series of conversation on what does this entail, even to say, you know what, I'm buying a system to the UN that is really giving room for 300 observers. If yours does not account for that, then we're gonna pay for that, but we need 300 observers in the room because we don't trust you. I mean, this is just an exaggeration, but we cannot just stay quiet hearing all of those technical explanations and then being shut down and shut off the room. I think we haven't discussed this, and I just want to say something else. We haven't heard any successful negotiation happening virtually at all in the UN in the past time since the pandemic began. We've seen failure after failure, precisely because, not only because we cannot have access to the room, but it's also because governments don't trust each other to negotiate. Where have been successful negotiations? In the WTO, in the space where power is being made to afford more room for corporations. And that's because they come like a bulldozer and quieting down all of the voices that are speaking on rights. So WTO is where really things are happening at the moment, and it is to the detriment of the global sphere. And strangely enough, the WTO is a space which has a very even more narrow framing for participation. So I'd say we need to take a step back to really assess what is happening, why are we going to the flow and going from, as Stefano Pratt always says, jumping from one meeting to meeting. But really, at this point in time, what is the case on attending all of those meetings if we're just passive spectators of those meetings? And I'm precisely because I'm saying we shouldn't give in on the UN. We shouldn't give up on the UN. This is why we really need to assess not only the technical and substantive issues of what is a systemic reform looking like, but also what are the technical ways or the logistical challenges that we have, and really address them. I don't think in this time we have taken the time to do that, and the General Assembly is just right around the corner. If we don't do that now, we're gonna have another missing year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia, for those thoughts. Um, let's hear from Meja. What is your take on all of these things? No, is there hope still, both for the multilateral system and for, how we can make our voices louder and how we can make sure that the UN is accountable, not just to the shareholders, but to the people. After all, it's we, the UN, we, the people. All right.
No, thank you very much. I'd like to begin with agreeing with both Bhumika and Emilia that despite all these negative experiences and disappointments with regard to outcome documents and the political direction of the UN, I think it is still a very important institution. I think it is important in setting the norms. It is important in setting the bar. It is also important in providing a forum where our governments, have a voice and can raise their concerns around issues, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of the experiences and build some political momentum around cohesion. So in that regard, I think the UN still remains a very important institution. The question is how we translating these norms into action, particularly for the powers that be. And I think that's where the gap is, because you see increasingly there is selective selection of priorities or of agenda that needs to be driven. And this is increasingly becoming also agenda of is beginning to bear on the UN preparatory processes for international conference such as the FFD. And it's something that we have to really strongly guard against. And this is where our activism then sets in to really target those respective institutions, including the bank and the fund, if it means defunding them, or, the other time we had slogan was of shutting down the bank and the fund. I don't remember the exact words, but if it means that is the framework, then so be it. Because it's really about providing space for the UN to do or carry out its mandate, and also providing it with enough resources to be able to support countries to respond. Because I don't think this is really, it's a global a crisis that those who have monies should be given more voice, better voices, stronger voices to articulate. So I think going forward, it's really also how we sensitize our governments with regard to the importance of these institutions, because how also they approach the FFD process, how they approach the UN processes have serious implications on the direction that institution takes. And I think from what we know now, the rich countries and directions and agenda and are making full use of it. The question is, how do we really also empower or support our governments, especially in the South, to be more active, to really consult their citizens more actively in ensuring that their issues are the ones that are reflected at the global stage. So that's how I see really this playing out. Otherwise, I think if you continue in this forum where you have permanent representatives who really do not keep in touch with their capitals on what are the priorities, we are still going to end up with these problems and they will never be resolved. I stop there. Thanks.
Okay. And with that, I hand you over, Bhumika, the floor.
I'm in complete agreement with my dear colleagues Emilia and Meja on so many levels, and just want to highlight that we have a crisis of accountability during these virtual times. It's very clear that the virtual negotiation space is infringing upon accountability to groups of member states as well as to observers, when we can sit physically and actually experience and observe discussions. It creates a layer of accountability and reporting and visibility and access that is being curtailed in this virtual time. So it is a really key challenge where these negotiation processes can lock in or decide on certain outcomes that are not agreed upon but fully by member states. And this can happen in a way where there's a lack of visibility and a lack of really being able to trace where and how decision makers such as co-facilitators or such as conveners are really taking into balanced account the different views of member states. Now, the key issue that is permeating the UN for a long time is the geopolitical tensions. And with regard to this, I do agree with my colleague Bodo that actually his question about how should civil society access and engage in forums like the FFD, that I agree with my colleagues that it is about heightening and amplifying the national level, increasing the accountability of national level in developed countries in particular, where there's an accountability between citizens and policymakers and an integration of global justice demands into that accountability between policymakers and citizens. We see a great example in climate change. In the UK, debt cancellation has been integrated as part of the climate motion bill nationally. And this is debt cancellation for developing countries. Can we see some of our key FFD issues, really become accountability platforms with national level accountability and organizing and holding national policymakers accountable for the impacts, the disproportionate impacts and agenda setting power that developed countries have on developing countries. And for this to be done through accountability and visibility and public reputation type of campaigns where policymakers are named, where there is a media element And that's the kind of national campaign that would be really powerful. And we need to see more of to link it to the UN sphere. One of the key limitations of the UN is that, unlike in national campaigning, there is no accountability that member states have to us as civil society participants in terms of the delegates that are appointed to negotiate at the UN. And their jobs and livelihoods are not contingent on being accountable to the civil society in their country. There isn't a direct link from the UN. And that is why the national level accountability should really be heightened in a way that the global justice demands are integrated into the national campaigns. And the connections that we have, especially to feminist justice struggles, which was raised in the questions, are very powerful. Very powerful, especially through the systematic underfinancing and deprivation of public systems and services, public goods and social infrastructure, including in care, health, education, that we see being laid out by this pandemic. The history of 40 years of fiscal austerity programs, structural adjustment, deregulation, and privatization, we see it laid bare today. And the linkages with the feminist struggles, I just want to point out three quick linkages. One, of course, the unpaid care economy and how that is linked to financing for public services. So there's a clear link between a lot of global economic justice principles and demands and issues to the unpaid care economy. Women as shock absorbers. We've seen in this pandemic the unpaid care work. Women have been shock absorbers of this pandemic, and to really then look at how the reports of IMF loans that are demanding budget reductions, especially in the public wage bill for public sector employees. This is going to target directly doctors, nurses, and teachers, the very public sector employees, disproportionately women in most all countries. And it's going to really, really derail not just pandemic recovery, SDG achievements, human rights, and especially climate change financing and resilience. So we see these intersections, especially with the fiscal austerity paradigm. And that will also, of course, be completely in alignment, in direct tangent to climate change. Because what in loss and damage, what is the first thing communities and people need when climate disasters strike? You know, it's social services, public systems, the most important significant bulwark or anchor in climate change resilience is strong public systems. And that is a key arena that climate justice movements, feminist justice movements, economic justice movements can coalesce around strong public systems to reclaim social and public services in the public domain, and to reclaim the role of the state and the social contract, which has been facilitating and servicing the private sector at the expense of citizens and the public goods, to be, absolutely and explicitly reversed. So there are linkages that can bring campaigns together. And, one of my biggest hopes and dreams is that exactly Emilia's campaign of campaigns, that all the strong justice social movement campaigns around the world can coalesce together in strategic ways, so that we're not siloed off into various different conferences, but that we collapse into a unified campaign to bring all the strengths of a unified campaign. And I especially think there is great strength in the climate campaign, especially. The climate campaign has the potential to incorporate all these elements of structural economic injustice and also direct through lines to feminist justice. Mm-hmm. So that's where I'd like to just contribute that. Thank you.
Well, we're trying to get there, Bhumika. That is our dream, that all our struggles will somehow converge and bam, make that moment that we've all been waiting for. We feel the power, we deliver the needed transformative changes to make systemic changes, not just an aspiration for many of us, but really working concretely to realize that. Yeah. So um, I'm sure a lot of our participants and friends agree with a lot of the discussions being mentioned here right now. There are three remaining questions in the question and answer box, and I hope that Emilia, Meja, and Bhumika could type in your response to the questions that Roberto and Zakir put forward in the Q&A box. But at this point, we'd like to pause for a moment, no? Because this has been such an intense conversation. You know, you really feel the passion and the energy. So we'd now like to ask our friends from the Tofu Creatives to show us, how they were able to capture that fire, that desire to work for systemic changes. So I'd like to call on Desiree and Nitya to share with us um, the magic. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so just to walk through the very, very rich discussion, we started with the context of the Green New Deal as an alternate vision, the need for transformation, and unpacking what financing for development really means, or FFD. And then there was emphasis on how we're experiencing multiple crises, um, the one vote, one country, one vote, but it also means more money and stronger voices, and how there has been exclusion of voices in these public fora, catering to the private finance gods, highlighting racialized gender divisions. Half of the agenda is still for the private sector. It has been fruitless conversations, and we're dealing with several beasts here. And yet, we still really need comprehensive solutions, and how these talks has been a diversion from comprehensive action, and also how we've been having such macro problems but pocket-sized solutions, and how we must evaluate the role of UN leadership, and how in 2020 we had more billionaires and more inequities and abuses, and we must challenge this power. And then there's a call for more accountability measures, and the speakers really centered on the message of continuing our activist role and having more collective action, campaigns, power, and having strong public systems. So, this us from Tofu Creatives, it was a pleasure drawing the big picture with all of you. Back to you, Tetet.
Thank you very much, Des and Nitya, for um, being able to capture the richness of the discussions. No, I think we'll be working closely with Tofu Creatives in the coming days to finalize this visual summary of our talk show tonight, and we will also be sharing this. Not just with the participants of this talk show, but also to a larger audience on social media, as RLS takes the issue of financing for development forward, no? And yes, time flies when we're having so much very, very passionate discussions around issues that really touch at the core, no, of the intersecting crisis. These issues that lies at the roots of the vulnerability of the intersecting multiple crises that affects everyone, particularly women in the global south, no? Because of the differentiated impacts of the pandemic and the multiple crises to all. So I think what I heard from tonight is the challenge for everyone who calls themselves, civil society, activists, etc., to try and pierce past through the technical technical veneer of all of these financing issues. Because really, when you talk about debt, it may sound technical, but it is really, a gut issue as it affects um, how we are provided or not with social protection, because governments have to make that difficult choice whether to keep on paying the debts or to save lives and provide its citizens the much needed social services. We see how the health crisis, economic crisis, social and political crisis call not just for urgent responses because there is an actual need on the ground for measures that alleviate the situation, but also going beyond and thinking more strategically. And that is where we talked about the need to rethink and struggle to change the existing architectures that continue to oppress and exploit people and planet. So let us all be Reds and experts. For those of us, let's all be Reds and experts, and let's try to realize our vision. And
That
maybe I can give our panelists 30 seconds as we close off this talk show. So, Emilia, your
Thank
30
you so much.
seconds.
I just wanted to say some things regarding the question on Roberto and Sakir. I think they're both aligning the same way. Of course, we have been demanding a UN tax convention precisely because individual or silos or specific initiatives on tax without a proper global setting of rules, then, as Roberto was saying, they may impact developing countries. However, it is a good signal politically that there is a conversation started by a powerful country. But then, so it is difficult to assess. But in that regard, what I was saying about Sakir is that. And I think it goes to the element I wanted to say is that I wouldn't propose a disdain for technical knowledge. And I think that that is something that we have felt in the last year. Many people who are so-called from the social movements have been slashing technical activists, and I think that is not constructive at all. Technical solutions are also needed, and these must come from a political analysis. But with the political analysis and without technical solutions, we won't achieve to anything. And this comes, for instance, with this proposal on only analyzing corruption or transparency without really addressing the real issues, for instance, on corporate capture, on tax havens, etc. So the term of corruption has been proposed by developed countries precisely because they say, oh, all of the illicit financial flows are because the developing countries are corrupt, whereas they don't want to go deep into analyze how the tax abuse by corporations are really heading. So we need to really understand also the technical nuances to really promote a political setting. And I just really want to highlight that because all of that jargon about leaving no one behind, without a technical approach on macro proposals, we're going to go anywhere. It's really a corny setting just to talk about leaving no one behind that may really be a slippery slope to poverty. So I really want to urge people to stop dismissing the technical proposals. It is really important to bring in the realities of those who are suffering the harshest impacts, but the solutions cannot come only at the local level, precisely because the local level is suffering the harsher impacts of the macro the dynamics. And the macro dynamics have a dynamic on their own. They have pillars, they have tensions, they have actors, they have functionings and gears, and we need to understand those. And I really need to say that out loud, because otherwise there is this tension, oh, you're not an activist enough, you're not social movement enough, and it's really exhausting to keep on hearing that type of comments sense when we are talking about the survival of people. So I just really want to invite everybody to also value the technical dimension of this conversation. And as you were saying, Tetet and Bhumika and Meja, this translates into the reality of people. So we need to become serious here and stop with this hostility of, oh, are you social movement or are you technical people? We need both, and I really don't know how to emphasize this enough. Thank you.
I think that's a very, very wonderful way of wrapping up our conversations. I say wrap up because this is not going to be the only conversation that we're going to have on these topics. And I repeat, no, our challenge and an invitation to everyone in the room and beyond is for us to become read and experts, because we are confronting huge structural institutions, policies, players. We have to be better than them. We are better than them because we have the movements, we have our feet on the ground, and we know why we are doing all of these things. All right. So I would really love to give the floor again to Meja and Bhumika, but we have already extended our time. So perhaps you will not really you will forgive me if I do not give you your 30 seconds anymore, but just to say thank you so much for being part of this awesome talk show, the first of it many kinds. And we hope that our friends also in the audience have found it meaningful, engaging, and challenging also for us to reflect on why we need to keep on persevering, why we need to keep on challenging and making our voices louder. So maybe 30 seconds again to Bhumika and Meja, and 30 seconds only.
If I get only 30 seconds, I just want to highlight that, I have been dreaming for a resurrection of the kind of global mass campaign that 50 years is enough tried to start, where we have tens and hundreds of thousands on the street, especially in the North, demanding their governments to on their power and their use of their voice and agenda setting in the international financial institutions to be accountable and to integrate global justice demands. And that kind of mass power, this is not an equally global issue. We have developed OECD countries that are setting the agenda in many of these institutions. So that kind of accountability and the voice and the demand from the people in the North, from campaigns and movements in the North. Just want to recall April 16th, 2000 in Washington, D.C., we had hundreds of thousands of activists on the street in front of the IMF and World Bank headquarters, and they were listening. They were scared. They were alert. And after that moment, they swiftly co-opted civil society into the Civil Society Policy Forum. So we saw what happened. And the same thing is happening in the UN very much. But a resurrection, a real reinvocation of that kind of mass movement. Thank you.
Thanks, Bhumika. We will try to make another world possible. And Meja, your 30 seconds. Make it count.
I think the two great ladies have made the points. We need each other, whether activists or analysts, it doesn't matter. Let's go back to the people, power to the people, and get them to the street to get politicians to think again. I thank you.
All right. So with that, again, many thanks to our panelists, Emilia, Bhumika, and Meja. And of course, many thanks to everyone who participated and made time for this conversation on the FFD, A Little Shop of Horrors. Thank you so much. Over and out.